The unmistakable, sickening sound of a heavy magnetic lock engaging echoed down the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway of the Oak Ridge Psychiatric Pavilion. Click, clack, thud. It was the sound of a cage being sealed. I stood on the wrong side of the reinforced safety glass, my hands pressed flat against the cold pane, my breath fogging the surface. I watched helplessly as two large, broad-shouldered orderlies physically guided my 19-year-old sister, Elara, down the corridor. Elara wasn't fighting them. She was completely, utterly catatonic. Her usually bright, observant hazel eyes were glazed over, vacant and terrified, staring blindly at a spot on the linoleum floor. She was shuffling her feet, her small frame swallowed by the oversized, pale blue paper scrubs the facility had forced her into. They had taken her clothes, they had taken her shoelaces, they had stripped away her dignity and her freedom in one swift, brutal motion. "Elara!" I screamed, pounding the side of my fist against the reinforced glass. "Elara, look at me. I'm right here. I'm not leaving you." She didn't turn around. I don't even think she heard me through the heavy cocktail of sedatives they had pumped into her system in the emergency room. The orderlies guided her around a corner, and she disappeared from my sight, swallowed by the bowels of the locked ward. I slumped against the wall, sliding down until my knees hit the floor, a raw, agonizing sob tearing its way out of my throat. "It's for the best, Harper. You have to accept that she is profoundly sick." The voice came from behind me. It was smooth, cultured, and dripping with a synthetic, nauseating brand of maternal sympathy. I wiped my face, pushed myself up from the floor, and turned around. Standing a few feet away, holding a designer handbag and wearing an immaculate, tailored black trench coat, was Genevieve, my stepmother. Genevieve was 45, 20 years younger than my late father, William. She possessed a striking, icy beauty, the kind of polished, surgical perfection that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to maintain. At this exact moment, she was putting on the performance of a lifetime. A single, perfectly calibrated tear rolled down her cheek. She dabbed at it with a silk handkerchief. "She is not sick, Genevieve," I growled, taking a step toward her, my hands balling into fists at my sides. "She has mild autism and generalized anxiety. She is neurodivergent. She is not psychotic, and she absolutely does not belong in a locked psychiatric asylum." Genevieve let out a long, shuddering sigh, shaking her head as if dealing with a stubborn, unreasonable child. She looked past me, making eye contact with the intake nurse sitting behind the security desk. "Denial is a very common stage of grief, Harper," Genevieve said loudly, ensuring the nurse heard every word. "I know you love your sister. I love her too. But we both saw what happened today. We both saw the violent meltdown, the screaming, the destruction of property." She threatened to hurt herself. As her legal medical proxy, I had to make the impossible, heartbreaking choice to protect her from herself. "You backed her into a corner," I shouted, the sheer injustice of her lies making my blood boil. "You fired her trusted therapist. You changed the locks on her art studio. You deliberately triggered a massive sensory overload to force a panic attack. And then you called a 5,150 psychiatric hold on her." "Nurse," Genevieve said softly, shrinking back slightly, playing the terrified victim flawlessly. "Could you please call security? My stepdaughter is highly agitated, and I am feeling a bit threatened." The intake nurse instantly reached for her radio. "Ma'am," the nurse warned me sternly, "you need to lower your voice and step away, or you will be escorted off the premises." I stared at Genevieve. Beneath the mask of the grieving, terrified mother, I saw it. A microscopic, triumphant smirk touched the corner of her lips. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and victorious. She had won. She had successfully locked my sister away. To understand the absolute, unadulterated evil of Genevieve's plan, you have to understand the staggering amount of money that was on the line, and the specific vulnerability of the girl she was trying to steal it from. My father, William, was a self-made billionaire in the logistics and shipping industry. He was a good man, but a busy one. Our biological mother passed away when Elara was only 4, and I was 13. For a long time, it was just the three of us. Elara was a beautiful, brilliant, but deeply sensitive child. She was diagnosed with level 1 autism spectrum disorder when she was 7. She possessed a genius-level IQ, an incredible talent for hyper-realistic oil painting, and a profound, beautiful empathy for animals. But the world was often too loud, too bright, and too chaotic for her. She relied heavily on strict routines, specific sensory environments, and a tight-knit circle of trusted people to navigate her anxiety. I adored her. I was fiercely protective of her. Then, 4 years ago, my father met Genevieve. Genevieve was a socialite, a woman whose entire career consisted of infiltrating wealthy circles and attaching herself to aging titans. She played the doting, loving partner perfectly. My father, lonely and aging, fell for it completely. They were married within 8 months. From the beginning, Genevieve deeply resented us. I was 24 at the time, living independently and working as a graphic designer. I saw right through her. But Elara, who was only 15, was still living at home. Genevieve couldn't stand the fact that Elara commanded so much of our father's attention, time, and resources. 6 months ago, the unthinkable happened. My father suffered a massive, fatal stroke in his sleep. The reading of his will was the moment Genevieve's mask permanently slipped. My father was a traditionalist, but he was also a realist. He left Genevieve a very generous multi-million-dollar cash payout and the deed to a vacation home in Aspen. But he did not leave her the empire. I received my inheritance directly. But because Elara was uniquely vulnerable, my father had established a colossal, fiercely protected ironclad trust fund for her. It contained $25 million in liquid assets, plus a massive stock portfolio. The stipulations of the trust were very specific. The trust would unlock and transfer entirely to Elara's control on her 21st birthday. Until then, my father had named Genevieve as the temporary trustee, allocating a monthly stipend for Elara's care. However, there was a secondary, fatal clause, a standard legal protection that Genevieve managed to weaponize. The will stated that if, at any point, Elara was deemed medically, psychologically, or legally incapacitated and permanently unable to care for herself, the trust would not unlock at 21. Instead, the designated trustee Genevieve would be granted a permanent legal conservatorship over the entire $25 million estate, granting her full, unmitigated access to the funds to manage the ward's lifelong care. Genevieve didn't want the generous allowance my father had left her. She wanted the $25 million, and the only way she could get it was to prove that Elara was fundamentally, permanently broken. The psychological torture began exactly 2 months after the funeral. Because Elara was still 19, Genevieve was her legal guardian. I tried to petition the court for custody, but Genevieve fought me tooth and nail, hiring a team of ruthless lawyers who argued that moving a neurodivergent teenager out of her childhood home would cause unnecessary trauma. The courts agreed. Elara had to stay in the estate with Genevieve. Genevieve began a systematic, invisible campaign of psychological warfare designed to completely destabilize my sister. Elara's stability relied on routine. Genevieve destroyed it. She fired Maria, the housekeeper who had been with us for 10 years, and was one of Elara's primary emotional anchors. She changed the brand of laundry detergent, knowing the new artificial scent caused Elara intense sensory distress. She accidentally threw away Elara's specialized noise-canceling headphones right before a massive, loud landscaping project began outside her bedroom window. Whenever I visited, I found Elara shrinking. The vibrant, artistic girl was being replaced by a terrified, jittery shell. "She hates me, Harper," Elara had whispered to me one afternoon, hiding under her weighted blanket in her bedroom. "She whispers things to me when no one is around. She tells me I'm a freak. She tells me Dad only loved me out of pity. When I start crying, she records me on her phone. I'm getting you out of here, Elle," I had promised, holding her tightly. "I'm meeting with a new lawyer on Monday. We are going to prove she's an unfit guardian." But Genevieve knew her time was running out. She knew I was building a legal case. So, she accelerated her timeline. She orchestrated the incident that landed Elara in the psychiatric ward. Yesterday morning, Genevieve fired Elara's longtime specialized therapist and canceled her anti-anxiety medication refills, claiming to the pharmacy that they were seeking a holistic, alternative approach. Then, Genevieve went into Elara's private art studio, the one place in the house that was Elara's absolute sanctuary. Genevieve took a box cutter and systematically destroyed 3 of Elara's finished oil paintings. Paintings that had taken Elara hundreds of hours to complete. Paintings of our late father. When Elara walked into the studio and saw the destruction, she suffered a massive, catastrophic autistic meltdown. It wasn't psychosis. It was a completely understandable reaction to the deliberate destruction of her emotional safety. She screamed. She threw her paint palettes against the wall. She collapsed on the floor, hyperventilating, entirely overwhelmed by the sensory and emotional trauma. Instead of comforting her, Genevieve locked the studio door, called 911, and reported that her stepdaughter was having a violent, psychotic break and was threatening to murder her. By the time I arrived at the estate, the paramedics had already strapped my terrified, overstimulated sister to a gurney. Genevieve was standing on the porch, crying for the police officers, showing them the destroyed paintings and claiming Elara had done it in a fit of schizophrenic rage. Because of Genevieve's status as legal guardian and the perfectly curated scene she had staged, the paramedics enacted a mandatory 5,150 psychiatric hold. Elara was taken to the Oak Ridge Psychiatric Pavilion, a highly secure facility. Once Elara was behind locked doors, Genevieve's true endgame was initiated. "You need to leave the hospital, Harper," Genevieve said to me now, snapping me back to the present moment in the sterile hallway. Her voice was cold and entirely devoid of the fake sympathy she had shown the nurse. "I am not leaving without seeing her," I hissed. "You aren't seeing her at all," Genevieve countered, stepping closer, dropping her voice so the nurse couldn't hear. "I am her medical proxy. I have explicitly restricted all visitors. The facility psychiatrist, Dr. Berman, who, by the way, is a very close, very expensive personal friend of mine, has evaluated her. He agrees with me. Her violent outburst yesterday clearly indicates a severe, deteriorating psychotic disorder." "He's a hired gun," I spat. "You paid him to write a fraudulent evaluation." "Prove it," Genevieve whispered, her eyes glittering with dark amusement. "Dr. Berman is officially recommending that the 72-hour hold be extended into an indefinite, involuntary commitment. On Monday morning, my lawyers are filing an emergency petition in family court. We are using Dr. Berman's evaluation, the police report from yesterday, and video evidence of her meltdowns to petition for full, permanent medical and financial conservatorship." The floor seemed to drop out from beneath me. "No," I breathed. "You can't do that. The judge will see right through you. The judge will see a severely mentally ill girl who destroyed her own property and needs lifelong care," Genevieve smiled. "And they will see a devoted stepmother willing to take on the burden of managing her $25 million trust fund. It's over, Harper. By Wednesday, Elara will be declared legally incapacitated. She will stay in this facility for a very, very long time, and I will control every single penny your father left behind." Genevieve turned on her heel, her designer heels clicking rhythmically against the linoleum, and walked out of the psychiatric pavilion, leaving me utterly shattered in her wake. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the small dining table in my apartment, surrounded by printed legal codes, medical definitions of autism, and pages of useless advice from cheap lawyers I had consulted in the past. I was fighting a billionaire's widow who had unlimited resources, a hired gun psychiatrist, and a perfectly fabricated narrative. I had nothing but the truth. And in family court, the truth is entirely useless without proof. I needed evidence. I needed something undeniable to show the judge that Genevieve was orchestrating this. At 2 a.m., a desperate, wild idea struck me. Elara was legally barred from the estate, locked in the hospital. Genevieve had mentioned to the intake nurse that she was leaving for a spa retreat in the mountains for the weekend to recover from the emotional trauma of committing her stepdaughter, returning just in time for the court hearing on Monday. The house was empty. I still had my old key to the side door of the estate. Genevieve had changed the front locks, but my father had installed a separate, manual deadbolt on the kitchen pantry door years ago that Genevieve rarely used and likely hadn't bothered to rekey. It was trespassing. It was illegal. But I didn't care. My sister's life was on the line. I drove to the massive, sprawling Blackwood estate in the dead of night. I parked my car 2 blocks away and walked through the manicured hedges. The house was completely dark. The security system was armed, but I knew the bypass code my father's birth year. I slipped my key into the pantry door. It turned with a soft click. I punched the code into the hidden keypad, breathing a massive sigh of relief when the red armed light blinked to a reassuring green. Ready. I crept through the silent, cavernous house, using only the flashlight on my phone. I went straight up the sweeping mahogany staircase to Elara's bedroom. Her room was a chaotic testament to the suddenness of her removal. Clothes were scattered on the floor. Her weighted blanket was thrown haphazardly across the bed. I started tearing through her room, opening drawers, looking under the mattress. I didn't know what I was looking for. A diary? A hidden camera? Then, I saw it. Sitting on Elara's desk, next to her sketchbook, was her LiveScribe smart pen. Because of her auditory processing issues, Elara often struggled to take written notes during her college lectures. My father had bought her a highly advanced digital smart pen. It had a built-in, high-capacity microphone designed to record hours of audio, syncing it directly to the digital notebook. Elara used it constantly. She carried it with her everywhere, using it as a comfort object, clicking the top when she felt anxious. My heart hammered in my chest. What if she had it with her in the art studio? What if she had clicked it on when Genevieve cornered her? I grabbed the pen and the digital notebook. I scrambled to turn on her laptop, plugging the pen into the USB port. The LiveScribe software booted up. I opened the audio directory. There were dozens of files, mostly labeled with her college course names. But at the very bottom of the list was a file recorded yesterday morning, just 20 minutes before the 911 call was placed. The file name was simply a string of random numbers. I put on Elara's headphones, my hands shaking violently. I clicked play. For the first 30 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of rustling fabric and heavy, panicked breathing. Elara was hyperventilating. Then, a voice cut through the audio. It was Genevieve. But it wasn't the sweet, cultured, victimized voice she used in public. It was a cold, vicious, venomous hiss. "Stop crying, you pathetic little freak," Genevieve's voice echoed through the headphones. "My paintings," Elara's voice came through, choked with devastating sobs. "You ruined them! Why did you do that? Daddy gave me those canvases." "Your daddy is dead, Elara," Genevieve spat cruelly. "And he was an absolute fool to leave $25 million to a broken toy like you. You can't even handle a change in laundry detergent, let alone a fortune." "I want Harper," Elara wept, the sound of her distress breaking my heart into a million pieces. "I'm going to tell Harper what you did." I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Then, the horrifying sound of a physical scuffle, Genevieve grabbing Elara. "You aren't telling anyone anything," Genevieve whispered, her voice dropping to a terrifying sociopathic register. "Go ahead. Scream. Throw things. Have one of your little autistic freakouts. That's exactly what I want you to do." "Get away from me!" Elara shrieked, clearly terrified. "I'm calling the police, Elara," Genevieve said smoothly, her tone entirely calculated. "I'm going to tell them you tried to attack me. Dr. Berman has the paperwork already drafted. They are going to take you to Oak Ridge. They're going to strap you to a bed, and they're going to drug you until you can't even remember your own name." "No, no, please." "Yes," Genevieve laughed, a dark, evil sound. "Once you're in the locked ward, I'm taking the trust fund. The judge will hand me the conservatorship on a silver platter. You are going to stay in that asylum for the rest of your miserable life, and I am going to spend every single penny your father left behind. Now, scream for me, sweetheart. Give them a show." The recording captured the sound of the studio door slamming shut and the lock clicking. The final minutes of the audio were nothing but my sister weeping alone in the room, completely trapped by a monster. I pulled the headphones off, gasping for air as if I had been drowning. Tears of pure, unadulterated fury streamed down my face. I had it. I had the smoking gun. It wasn't just proof of Genevieve's manipulation. It was a recorded, explicit confession of her intent to commit medical fraud, custodial kidnapping, and grand larceny. I exported the audio file to 3 separate encrypted flash drives. I emailed it to my own secure server. Genevieve thought she was a master chess player. She thought she had outsmarted a neurodivergent teenager and a grieving sister. She thought Monday's court hearing was going to be her coronation. I looked at the silver flash drive resting in the palm of my hand. I was going to walk into that courtroom, and I was going to drop a nuclear bomb on her life. The heavy oak doors of Family Courtroom 3B felt less like an entryway to justice and more like the gates of hell. It was 9 a.m. on Monday morning. The weekend I had spent agonizing over the audio recording, consulting with my lawyer, and pacing the floor of my apartment was finally over. The battlefield was set. I sat at the respondent's table next to my attorney, David Caldwell. David was a former federal prosecutor who had transitioned into high-stakes family law. He was a man who moved with the quiet, lethal precision of a coiled snake. When I had played the audio recording for him in his office on Sunday afternoon, he hadn't gasped or acted shocked. He had simply leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across his face, and said, "We are going to decimate her." Across the aisle, at the petitioner's table, sat Genevieve. She looked absolutely flawless. She wore a modest, high-necked navy blue dress that screamed, "Respectable grieving widow." Her makeup was done impeccably to make her look slightly pale, slightly exhausted, as if the burden of caring for my psychotic sister was slowly draining the life out of her. Sitting next to her was her high-priced attorney, Richard Trent, and directly behind them, in the first row of the gallery, sat Dr. Berman, the hired gun psychiatrist. "Don't look at her, Harper," David whispered to me, not taking his eyes off his legal pad. "Let her feel completely confident. Hubris is her greatest weakness. Let her climb all the way to the top of the pedestal before we kick it out from under her." I nodded, gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles ached. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Rosalind Hayes entered the courtroom. She was a woman in her late 50s, known for her sharp intellect and an absolute zero-tolerance policy for people who wasted her court's time. She took her seat at the bench, adjusted her glasses, and looked down at the sprawling file in front of her. "We are here for the emergency petition regarding the medical and financial conservatorship of William Vance," Judge Hayes began, her voice crisp and commanding. "The petitioner, Genevieve Vance, is seeking permanent legal guardianship and immediate access to the ward's trust fund, citing profound psychological deterioration. Mr. Trent, you may proceed." Richard Trent stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He walked toward the center of the room, adopting a tone of deep, manufactured sorrow. "Your Honor," Trent began, "we are here today on a matter of absolute tragedy. Genevieve Vance has dedicated the last 4 years of her life to loving and supporting her neurodivergent stepdaughter. But unfortunately, love cannot cure profound mental illness. Following the tragic passing of Elara's father, her condition has rapidly, violently deteriorated. She has gone from being mildly autistic to actively psychotic." Trent gestured toward the gallery. "On Friday, Elara suffered a violent break from reality. She destroyed valuable property, screamed obscenities, and physically threatened her stepmother. We have submitted the police report and the $5,150 psychiatric hold authorization. For her own safety, Elara was placed in the Oak Ridge Psychiatric Pavilion. She requires lifelong specialized care. We are asking the court to grant Mrs. Vance full conservatorship so she can unlock the funds necessary to provide Elara with the permanent institutional care she so desperately needs." Judge Hayes frowned, making a note on her legal pad. "And the medical evidence to support this claim of permanent psychosis?" "We called Dr. Arthur Berman to the stand," Trent announced. Dr. Berman walked to the witness box. He looked exactly like the kind of doctor who catered exclusively to billionaires: expensive suit, perfectly styled hair, and an air of absolute, unquestionable authority. He swore the oath and sat down. "Dr. Berman," Trent said, "you evaluated Elara Vance on Friday evening at the Oak Ridge facility. What were your findings?" "Profound, treatment-resistant schizophrenia coupled with severe autistic regression," Dr. Berman lied smoothly, not missing a beat. "When I examined her, she was catatonic, nonverbal, and highly volatile. Her medical history indicates a fragile baseline, but the sudden onset of violent outbursts and the destruction of her own artwork is indicative of a complete psychotic break. It is my professional medical opinion that she poses a severe danger to herself and others. She cannot be integrated into society. She requires permanent institutionalization." Thank you, doctor, Trent said, looking immensely satisfied. He turned to our table. Your witness. David Caldwell stood up. He didn't carry any notes. He just walked to the podium and looked at Dr. Berman. Dr. Berman, David said, his voice surprisingly conversational. You state that Elara's violent outburst was indicative of a spontaneous psychotic break. Is it possible that this meltdown was actually a perfectly understandable, albeit extreme, autistic reaction to a severe external provocation? No, Dr. Berman said arrogantly. My assessment is absolute. The episode was entirely unprovoked. Mrs. Vance assured me that Elara simply walked into the room and began destroying things in a fit of delusion. So, your entire diagnosis of unprovoked psychosis relies heavily on the testimony of the petitioner, Genevieve Vance? David asked, raising an eyebrow. It relies on my expert medical observation. Coupled with the context provided by her primary caregiver, Dr. Berman snapped, looking slightly irritated. I see, David said. And did you perform any independent toxicology screens? Did you investigate her living conditions? Or did you simply take Mrs. Vance's check? Write the word psychotic on a piece of paper and condemn a 19-year-old girl to a locked ward? Objection! Trent shouted, slamming his hand on the table. Counsel is badgering the witness and implying professional misconduct. Sustained, Judge Hayes said, though she looked at Dr. Berman with a suddenly narrowed gaze. Watch your tone, Mr. Caldwell. My apologies, Your Honor, David said smoothly. No further questions for this witness. Dr. Berman stepped down, looking ruffled. Genevieve, however, looked completely unfazed. She was ready for her moment in the spotlight. We call Genevieve Vance to the stand, Trent said. Genevieve walked gracefully to the witness box. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and took her seat. She immediately looked at the judge, her eyes swimming with fresh, perfectly timed tears. Mrs. Vance, Trent asked gently, could you describe what happened on Friday morning? Genevieve let out a trembling breath. It was terrifying, she whispered, her voice cracking beautifully. I was in the hallway. Elara had been agitated all week. She walked into her art studio, and suddenly, she just started screaming. It was a guttural, horrific sound. I ran to the door and saw her taking a box cutter to her own paintings. The paintings of her late father. Genevieve paused to dab her eyes with her silk handkerchief. I tried to stop her. I told her I loved her. But she looked at me with these dead, empty eyes. She raised the blade. She told me she was going to kill me. I had to lock the door and call the police. It broke my heart to do it, but she isn't my Elara anymore. The sickness has completely taken her mind. Thank you, Genevieve. You did the right thing, Trent said softly. Your witness, Mr. Caldwell. David Caldwell didn't walk to the podium this time. He walked directly to the center of the courtroom, holding nothing but a small, silver flash drive. Mrs. Vance, David began, his voice dropping into a cold, dangerous register. You just testified, under oath, that Elara's meltdown was completely unprovoked. You testified that she destroyed the paintings herself, and you testified that she threatened your life. Yes, Genevieve said, lifting her chin, playing the brave victim. That is the truth. You swear to this court that you did not provoke her? You swear that you did not deliberately trigger an autistic meltdown for your own financial gain? Objection, Trent barked. Counsel is making wild, baseless accusations. I am asking the witness to confirm her sworn testimony. Your Honor, David countered. Overruled. The witness will answer, Judge Hayes said. I swear it, Genevieve said, looking directly at me with a microscopic sneer. I loved that girl. I would never hurt her. David nodded slowly. Your Honor, at this time, the defense would like to submit Exhibit F into evidence. It is an audio recording captured by Elara Vance's personal LiveScribe digital smart pen, which was active and recording inside the art studio on the morning of the incident. Genevieve's face completely froze. The color drained from her cheeks so fast she looked like a wax mannequin. Her eyes darted to my face, and for the first time, I saw genuine, unadulterated terror. Objection! Trent shouted, panicking. This evidence was not submitted during discovery. Furthermore, if it was obtained without my client's consent, it violates wiretapping statutes. Your Honor, David said, his voice booming over Trent's objection. This recording was made by the ward, on her own personal device, in her own private studio. It was retrieved by her sister, the respondent, who legally shares the estate's access codes. Furthermore, under the crime fraud exception, any audio recording that captures the active planning and execution of a felony, specifically medical fraud, custodial kidnapping, and grand larceny, is immediately admissible as emergency evidence. Judge Hayes looked at the silver flash drive in David's hand. She looked at Genevieve's sudden, ghostly pallor. "The objection is overruled," Judge Hayes said, her voice turning to ice. "I want to hear exactly what is on that drive, Mr. Caldwell. Play the audio." The bailiff took the flash drive and plugged it into the courtroom's multimedia system. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was a suffocating, terrifying vacuum. And then, the speakers crackled to life. First came the sound of rustling fabric. Then, the heavy, panicked sound of Elara hyperventilating. Then, Genevieve's true voice echoed through the courtroom. Not the sweet, cultured, weeping widow who had just testified. It was the cold, vicious hiss of a monster. "Stop crying, you pathetic little freak," the court reporter audibly gasped. Judge Hayes's spine went rigid. "My paintings," Elara's voice wept through the speakers, a sound of pure agony. "You ruined them. Why did you do that? Daddy gave me those canvases." "Your daddy is dead, Elara." Genevieve's recorded voice spat back cruelly. "And he was an absolute fool to leave $25 million to a broken toy like you. You can't even handle a change in laundry detergent, let alone a fortune." In the witness box, Genevieve was shaking violently. She covered her mouth with her hands, looking as if she were going to vomit. Her lawyer, Richard Trent, was staring at her with wide, horrified eyes, realizing his client had just committed perjury and dragged him into a federal crime. "I want Harper," Elara sobbed. "I'm going to tell Harper what you did." The audio captured the sound of Genevieve grabbing Elara. "You aren't telling anyone anything. Go ahead. Scream. Throw things. Have one of your little autistic freakouts. That's exactly what I want you to do." Judge Hayes took off her glasses. She stared at Genevieve, her expression transforming from judicial neutrality into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. "I'm calling the police, Elara. I'm going to tell them you tried to attack me. Dr. Berman has the paperwork already drafted. They are going to take you to Oak Ridge. They're going to strap you to a bed, and they're going to drug you until you can't even remember your own name." In the gallery, Dr. Berman suddenly stood up, his face dripping with sweat, trying to silently back out of the courtroom. "Bailiff," Judge Hayes snapped, pointing a finger at the psychiatrist. "Do not let that man leave this room." The bailiff immediately stepped in front of the heavy oak doors, blocking Dr. Berman's escape. The audio continued to its devastating conclusion. "Once you're in the locked ward, I'm taking the trust fund. The judge will hand me the conservatorship on a silver platter. You are going to stay in that asylum for the rest of your miserable life, and I am going to spend every single penny your father left behind. Now, scream for me, sweetheart. Give them a show." The sound of the door slamming and the lock clicking echoed through the speakers, followed by the heartbreaking sound of my sister weeping alone. David Caldwell walked over to the console and stopped the playback. The silence rushed back into the room, but it was no longer tense. It was lethal. "Genevieve Vance," Judge Hayes said softly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of an executioner's axe. Genevieve slowly lowered her hands from her face. She was weeping, but there were no perfectly calibrated tears this time. Her makeup was running. She was hyperventilating, completely shattered by the exposure of her own evil. I can explain," Genevieve choked out, her voice a pathetic trembling rasp. She edited that. "Harper hates me. She fabricated that audio." "Do not insult my intelligence," Judge Hayes hissed, leaning over the bench. "You sat in my courtroom, placed your hand on a Bible, and wept while you committed perjury. You intentionally terrorized a neurodivergent 19-year-old girl, destroyed her property, and conspired with a corrupt medical professional to fraudulently imprison her in a psychiatric ward, all for the explicit purpose of stealing $25 million. Judge Hayes turned her blazing fury toward the gallery. "Dr. Berman, you falsified medical records to commit a healthy, terrified girl to a locked ward. I am personally forwarding this audio, and the court transcripts to the state medical board and the district attorney's office. Your license is effectively void, and you will be facing federal conspiracy charges by the end of the day. Dr. Berman sank into the gallery bench, burying his face in his hands. Judge Hayes turned back to her legal pad, her pen flying across the paper with furious, decisive strokes. The petition for permanent conservatorship is denied with extreme prejudice, Judge Hayes announced. Genevieve Vance, you are hereby immediately stripped of your status as temporary trustee and legal medical proxy for Elara Vance. Those rights are transferred entirely and immediately to Harper Vance. I closed my eyes, tears of pure, overwhelming relief pouring down my face. I gripped David's arm, unable to formulate words. Furthermore, Judge Hayes continued, glaring at Genevieve. Bailiff, take Mrs. Vance into custody. She is to be held in contempt of court for blatant perjury, and I am requesting the immediate involvement of the Fraud Division of the Police Department to investigate her for attempted grand larceny and custodial kidnapping. No! Genevieve shrieked as the bailiff approached the witness box with a pair of steel handcuffs. No! You can't do this! I am William Vance's widow. You can't treat me like this. Put your hands behind your back, ma'am, the bailiff ordered, grabbing her arm and spinning her around. The click of the handcuffs echoing in the courtroom was the exact inverse of the sound I had heard in the psychiatric ward 3 days ago. It wasn't the sound of a cage closing on an innocent girl. It was the sound of a monster finally being locked away. As they dragged Genevieve out of the courtroom, her screams echoing down the marble hallway, Judge Hayes looked at me. The harshness in the judge's eyes completely melted away. Miss Vance, Judge Hayes said gently, the clerk is printing the emergency release order right now. Go get your sister out of that hospital. The drive to the Oak Ridge Psychiatric Pavilion was a blur. I gripped the steering wheel, running 2 yellow lights, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I burst through the front doors of the facility, slamming the court order with the judge's raised seal directly onto the intake nurse's desk. It was the same nurse who had threatened to call security on me on Friday. She took one look at the paperwork, her eyes widening, and immediately picked up her phone. 10 minutes later, the heavy magnetic locks on the double doors disengaged. Click, clack, thud. The doors swung open. Elara was walking down the hallway, escorted by a bewildered orderly. She was still wearing the pale blue paper scrubs. She looked exhausted, pale, and incredibly fragile. But the moment she saw me standing in the lobby, she stopped. "Harper," she whispered, her voice raspy and broken. "I'm here, Elle," I sobbed, running across the lobby. I threw my arms around her, pulling her into a fierce, crushing embrace. "I'm here. I told you I wasn't going to leave you." Elara buried her face in my shoulder, her small hands gripping the back of my jacket so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wept, but it wasn't the sound of terror anymore. It was the sound of a nightmare ending. "She told me you weren't coming back," Elara cried into my coat. "She told me I was going to stay here forever." "She lied," I whispered fiercely, kissing the top of her head. "She's gone, Elara. She is never, ever going to hurt you again." The judge saw everything. "We're going home." We walked out of the sterile, suffocating hospital and stepped into the bright, crisp afternoon sunlight. Elara took a deep breath, closing her eyes as the fresh air hit her face. I wrapped my jacket around her shoulders, guiding her to the car. The aftermath of Genevieve's spectacular downfall was swift and absolute. The audio recording was the undisputed smoking gun. Genevieve's high-priced lawyers abandoned her the second they realized they were implicated in a massive fraud case. Facing decades in federal prison for elder abuse by manipulating my father's trust conditions, perjury, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit medical kidnapping, Genevieve eventually accepted a plea deal. She was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. She was also completely stripped of the inheritance my father had left her, as the trust specifically contained a clause nullifying her payout if she committed a felony against the estate or his children. The vacation home in Aspen, the millions in cash, it all reverted back to Elara and me. Dr. Berman lost his medical license and was heavily fined, avoiding prison only by testifying against Genevieve. As for Elara, the healing process was slow, but beautiful. I used a portion of my inheritance to buy us a massive, secluded farmhouse surrounded by acres of quiet, peaceful woods. It was the perfect sensory environment. There were no loud landscapers. There was no toxic stepmother whispering cruelties in the hallway. We converted the massive sunlit barn in the backyard into a brand new art studio for her. We bought the best canvases, the most expensive oil paints, and surrounded the room with large windows that overlooked the forest. 6 months after the trial, I stood in the doorway of the barn, holding 2 mugs of hot tea. Elara was standing in front of a massive canvas, her headphones on, humming softly to herself. The pale, terrified, catatonic girl from the psychiatric ward was entirely gone. In her place was a vibrant, focused, brilliant artist. She was painting a portrait of our father. It wasn't a sad painting. It was full of bright, warm colors, capturing the exact way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. She felt me standing there and turned around. She pulled her headphones down, offering me a wide, genuine smile. "Do you think he'd like it?" Elara asked, pointing at the canvas with a paint-stained brush. I walked over, handing her a mug of tea, and looked at the beautiful, resilient masterpiece she was creating. "He would absolutely love it, Elle," I smiled, putting my arm around her shoulder. "He would be so incredibly proud of you." Genevieve had tried to lock my sister away in the dark because she saw her sensitivity as a weakness to be exploited. But she didn't realize that sensitivity was exactly what made Elara's light shine so brightly. We had survived the monster in our own home. And as we stood in the quiet studio, surrounded by art and love, I knew that no one would ever be able to dim her light again.